So yesterday, ArenaNet put out a patch that changed a lot of things with a lot of classes. Of particular interest to me is the changes to Necromancer, particularly since a lot of these affect Power Reaper. A lot of people have been playing this up as a huge buff to Power Reaper. It's certainly a huge buff in PvE. It is nowhere near as huge as a buff in PvP as people are making it out to be. So I'll start with the smaller changes. There's some miscellaneous buffs to minions that don't matter because minions are bad. There's a miscellaneous buff to Terror, which almost makes the trait worth considering on a Condi build, but not really. So it doesn't really matter. There was a change to Dread and Spite. That change doesn't really matter because that trait's still bad. They nerfed Ritual of Life, which is the Rezzing trait in Blood Magic, so the well spawned by that trait will only revive at 4% rather than 7%, so they nerfed Necro Speed Rezzing. I don't know why they nerfed Necro Speed Rezzing while not touching Firebrand's insane Rezzing potential and capabilities, but whatever. Furious Demise, that's a minor in Curses. They increased the Fury granted by it, and it grants Precision, so this is a slight buff to Curses builds. Not hugely noticeable, but it is a buff. Lingering Curse, which is Grandmaster in Curses, it's been buffed with increased condition damage, and it changes Feast of Corruption, which is Scepter 3, into an area effect attack. You're not really going to take this trait much in PvP, at least on Scourge, because it competes against, I'm blanking on the name of that trait, the one that gives you a percentage of healing for Condi output, which is the main sustain trait for Scourge and Curses Scourge has massive sustain issues, so you can't really afford to be dropping that. And the area attack, the new area attack that comes from this trait for Feast of Corruption is such low radius, you're not really going to be hitting multiple people with it very often anyways. That kind of sums it up for the... Oh, and one other. The Strength of Undeath had a slight damage modifier increase. It now grants 10% damage modifier instead of 5%. Not really noticeable in PvP, but I'm sure the PvEers will particularly love this trait change because it is more damage modifier. Now on to the serious changes. So there's really 3 changes that are important for Necro and really just Reaper. 1, Death Perception. The critical hit chance of this trait has been changed from 50% while in Shroud to 33% while in Shroud, but it now also grants 300 Ferocity while in Shroud, where it previously did not grant any Ferocity. The second change is Reaper's Onslaught. This trait now grants Quickness while in Reaper Shroud instead of just giving a 15% attack speed increase. And it still grants Ferocity. And then the third change is to Gluttony, and I'll speak about that in a minute. But the change to Reaper's Onslaught and Death Perception. So both of these are traits that give you a Ferocity bonus while in Shroud, where the former gives you a crit bonus in addition to the Ferocity bonus, and Reaper's Onslaught now grants Pulsing Quickness, which means way faster attack speed in addition to Ferocity. The Death Perception one is basically a free buff to Soul Reaping Reaper, which takes that trait anyways. You do have slightly less crit chance, which means you do crit slightly less, so you do have lower damage reliability, but the extra Ferocity bonus is totally worth it, so you get much more spike damage, and it's a very nice change. In terms of damage potential, not that Reaper really had problems with damage potential, but okay. The Reaper's Onslaught change, which is a change that a lot of Necros have been making out to be a huge bonus for PvP, it isn't. While, yes, having Pulsing Quickness while in Shroud is pretty impactful, because it allows you to attack much faster, which is particularly nice given the problem that Reapers had with the large cast times on Shroud skills. But what people are missing here is you lose Blighter's Boon if you take Reaper's Onslaught. And the importance of Blighter's Boon cannot be overstated. Because it gives you a huge amount of life force gain, and it also gives you a bit of healing in Shroud. It is the backbone of Power Reaper's sustain. And some people have been saying that, well, since you're already taking Soul Reaping for Death Perception, you can run a Traded Spectrals build for all that burst Life Force generation. And yes, you can do that. Traded Spectrals do have a massive amount of burst Life Force generation. But the issue there is, if you do that, you're burning utility slots for Life Force generation. Whereas Blighter's Boon, you get it whenever you gain a boon, most of those boons being Might, which you gain just through doing regular actions from the traits in Spite and Sigils and whatever runes you might have selected. Which means Blighter's Boon gives you a large amount of resource without burning utility slots, whereas pretty much any other solution for gaining Life Force does. Which is why Blighter's Boon is so good. And of course it also gives you a little bit of healing while in Shroud. And I played around with trying to make a no Blighter's Boon build work. It doesn't work. Like, Reaper's Onslaught is not worth it. It's also important to note that if the other team has a Necro and that Necro is smart, they will target your quickness if you have Reaper's Onslaught. And if your quickness gets corrupted, it corrupts into slow, which will basically make getting any kind of a cast off impossible. So it's just not worth it. Death Perception is totally worth it, just not Reaper's Onslaught. Now, Gluttony. This is the last serious change, and it's probably the most underrated change of all the changes, because Gluttony is probably the single most important change of this entire patch. So Gluttony, in addition to its previous effects, it now grants Might when you gain Life Force. This is huge, because first off, more Might means more damage, but more importantly, Might generation equals Blighter's Boon procs. Now, I will note, Gluttony, while it does not have an ICD listed, does have a lot of restrictions on it in terms of when it procs. And they're very strange restrictions. So, Gluttony, it will proc once per Life Force source after a weapon swap. But it won't proc multiple times from the same thing, most of the time. So, like, for example, Soul Eater, which gives you passive Life Force generation while you have a Greatsword equipped. If you weapon swap into Greatsword, the first proc of Soul Eater will proc Gluttony. But the second and all subsequent ticks of Soul Eater will not proc Gluttony until you swap out and then swap back. Or, sorry, swap out of Greatsword and then swap back. And this is true of basically any skill. Like, any Life Force generating trait or skill will only give one proc of Gluttony per weapon swap, with the weapon swap resetting Gluttony. Which is a very strange way. Like, I would have expected them to put like a 2-second ICD or something on the trait, not this weird shenanigans. But this is how they've decided to do it, so okay. There are exceptions to that weapon swap rule, though. I noticed when auto-attacking a Golem with the Greatsword auto chain that every 3 to 4 autos, Gluttony would go off again, even without weapon swapping. So there's like exceptions to the rule. But they're very inconsistent, and it's very odd. It's very strange how Gluttony works. But regardless of how strange it works, it is a pretty substantial increase in Might generation. I definitely noticed the increase in how much Might stacks I had at a given time, and I definitely noticed the increased Blighter's Boon procs. And Blighter's Boon does proc Gluttony. So you actually have this thing where, like, if you swap into Greatsword with Soul Eater, the first tick of Soul Eater procs Gluttony, which gives you that Might, which procs Blighter's Boon, which gives you 1% Life Force, which then procs Gluttony again, which gives Might, which procs Blighter's Boon again, although the second Blighter's Boon does not proc Gluttony again. Which is probably a good thing, because if it did, you'd have a recursive loop of perpetual Life Force generation, which would invariably crash the server. Which might be why they have such a strange implementation. Although, again, I don't understand why they didn't just put an ICD on this trait like every other normal trait. But it's a huge advantage regardless of how it works. It's definitely the biggest, most noticeable buff that I found. It is important to note, with all these buffs for Soul Reaping, it makes Soul Reaping a very good offensive trait line for Reaper. Not necessarily a sustained trait line. In fact, we're in this interesting point where Spite Blood Magic is basically... Spite Blood Magic Reaper is the setup you run if you want to do high sustain, and then if you want to do lots of damage, you run Spite Soul Reaping Reaper. Which I'm still not entirely convinced though that Soul Reaping as a whole is good enough for high level competitive play, because like squishiness is not something you can afford to be as a necro, because you have no disengage. You're going to get hit with everything, and since you have no mobility, if you get killed and go on respawn, it'll take you a while to get back into the fight. Like, Necromancer is just not a class that can afford to be glassing out. So whether or not Soul Reaping becomes a better pick over Blood Magic for Reapers remains to be seen. Unfortunately, for all of these changes, even if Soul Reaping does end up being a slightly better pick than Blood Magic, it ultimately doesn't help Reaper that much, because Reaper's issue is not damage, and it has never been damage, at least as far as PvP is concerned. It has always been the inability of Reaper to stick to a target, and the fact that Reaper is far too vulnerable to control effects, both soft control and hard control. And until that gets fixed, like, nothing's really going to change with Reaper's position in the meta. All the damage in the world does not matter if Reaper cannot consistently hit its targets. And that's basically it. That's the end-all be-all for Reaper's viability, is until that issue is fixed, Reaper is always going to be B tier, no matter how much damage we get.